Okay, and I think probably our first official pandemic, and we are joined thankfully from Mexico by Melina Gastelum, who will be presenting the April ENSO seminar. And we have one or two live participants along as well. So I'm so very happy that Melina was able to join us, although the heavy load of the internet is making this a somewhat less reliable connection than would ordinarily be. I think we will sort of push on for the moment and hope that things straighten themselves out a little bit.
Okay.
There we go. Yeah. So we're losing the picture just a little bit intermittently, but hopefully, as I said, it will stabilize. And I think once we get going, we'll have the slides will provide us some stability, I think, as much as anything else. So I first I got to see you present at a workshop in San Sebastian in Spain last summer, Melina, and really enjoyed the presentation and I think you're raising some really important issues actually about the issues of scale, and particularly about the issues of dynamism and time and the role of temporality in how affordances structure behavior at different scales. And this is, I understand this is all coming out of your PhD work, is that right?
Yeah, it's a product of my PhD thesis. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess with that we have, I'm just looking now, we have our usual sort of quick check as to whether or not, I think we are fully live. We're got a few people engaged on the stream. And I guess without further ado, I'll invite you maybe to start the presentation while our connection is good and solid. So I invite you to Melina to share your screen and
okay.
And April ENSO seminar.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you very much, Marek, for this invitation. I'm really happy to be part of the ENSO seminars. And of course, it's a strange time, so we have to mention that at some point, although this is a kind of breathe to concentrate on something else in the things we do. So I hope whoever sees this that enjoys it. And as Marek said, this is a presentation of my PhD thesis, one of the products that I hope come onwards. And this is actually under review in the special issue that Marek, Ezequiel, and Tony and Manuel are editing. And I'm very happy to be participating in it. And well, the title of this talk is Scale Matters, Temporality of the Perception of Affordances. And well, what I want to do in this talk is to explain how I seek to unify enactive and ecological approaches to cognitive science by emphasizing the fact that both approaches view cognitive processes as being inherently temporally extended. My claim is that characterizing the temporal scales in which perception of affordances occur, they will serve different purposes of explanation within the theories of radical embodied cognitive science. Specifically, I want to bring together, on the one hand, Chemero's 2009 dynamicist understanding of affordances, which he called affordances 2.0, with, on the other hand, a distinction originally made by Varela in 1999 and later taken up by Sean Gallagher between three different timescales for understanding cognition, which is the elementary, the integrative, and the narrative. And I will go into all of these things step by step. So There are at least 3 points of agreement, I think, between enactivism and ecological psychology. First, they share a conception of perception that makes it continuous with action. So for an activist, perception is understood as something we do, and in order to preserve our form of life, as Di Paolo and Alba Noe and Eras Escribano have noticed, while for ecological psychology, perception occurs in terms of invitations to act, and it is an achievement of the individual, not an appearance in the theater of his consciousness. Second, for both approaches, the environment is constitutive of cognition. For an activist, the environment is a constitutive element of adaptive interactions, which are essential to sense-making and to maintain a central tension that gives autonomy to a living system. This autonomy emerges from a primordial tension, which refers to those dynamics by which the identity of an organism requires to persist while opening itself to the environment and making sense of it at the same time. Meanwhile, ecological psychology makes the organism-environment system as the unit of analysis of cognition as a whole. In other words, ecological psychology explains the way in which agents perceive information about affordances and relates to them. So for both approaches, cognition doesn't happen inside the head, but in the interaction of an organism with its environment. And third, both the cognitive and the ecological psychology definitions of environment coincide in that the surroundings are primarily meaningful for the agent in an embodied, non-semantic, non-representational sense. So the idea of sense-making in enactivism shows that the world is meaningful and constitutive in as much as it allows the organism to perform a certain action that is relevant for its autonomy, which is close to the ecological idea of affordance. That is, the things are perceived meaningfully as they call for action. And therefore, the unit of analysis is the animal environmental system as a coupled unity. So in this talk, the hypothesis is that by saying that the environment is constitutive of cognition and adding that by understanding how the scales of temporality of the processes by which the engagement with it occurs, that is the perception of affordances, we can step forward in bringing together these two approaches. So for this, I will claim that the conception of affordances 2.0 has to be taken seriously and further explained as a bridge between them. This will involve taking the temporal dimension of abilities in affordances seriously, particularly in terms of interaction across multiple temporal scales. So for this, I think that perception of affordances should be characterized in terms of dynamical agent environment systems with abilities and aspects of the environment understood as constraints on the potential trajectories of such systems. So I will just briefly talk about affordances 2.0. Just I know many people have treated them, so I'm not going to expand a lot here. But it's important to say that in the ecological psychology tradition, there are at least 3 important assumptions at its basis: that perception is direct, that perception is for action, and that perception is of affordances. And not all conceptions of affordances are compatible with the idea of bringing together ecological psychology and enactivism. So, for example, conceiving affordances as dispositional properties might seem like reducing cognitive agents' engagement with the world to an almost mechanical response which directly contradicts the enactive conception of sense-making. So I believe that in line with Baggs and Chemero, their paper in 2018, that this conception of affordances as dispositions describes one of the various possible levels of analysis of the agent-environment engagement, namely the total set of skills shared by agents with a common biological organization, a common niche, and a common pattern of behavior, while the enactive approach describes a different level, namely the individual one. So, as Chemero rightly notes, ecological psychologists usually define affordances statically in this way of dispositions. So consequently, as an attempt to dynamize the concept of affordances, he introduced the concept of affordances 2.0, which we have the exact quotation here. So affordances are relations between abilities to perceive and act and features of the environment. Affordances and abilities are not just defined in terms of one another, as in the dispositional and relational views, but causally interact in real time and are causally dependent on one another. This reconceptualization of affordances is explicitly formulated to make the natural, but largely unmade, connections between ecological psychology and enactivist movement in cognitive science. So the key point is to conceptualize affordances as interacting in real time, as dynamically coupling with the rest of the environment and among them. Silverstein and Chemero in 2011 expanded on this, saying that the animal's endogenous system has endogenous dynamics that generates and constitute the sensorimotor abilities and the whole nervous system. The sensorimotor abilities are coupled with a specific niche, which in turn modulates the dynamics of the nervous system. So affordances and abilities are not just defined in terms of one another, but causally interact in real time and are causally dependent on one another in a non-linear fashion. And here we have the Tony Chemero schemes of 2009. So affordances 2.0 are compatible with an active idea that agents actively make sense of their environment in terms of how it affects them. But the question is, how does it happen and in which temporal scales? So another important conception that I will use in this talk is the difference between physical world, habitat, and umwelt that Baggs and Chemero in 2018 recently developed. They use the distinction to clarify disagreements between ecological psychology and enactivists also, as well as to clarify certain tensions within the former in relation to the conceptualization of affordances. So Gibson had made a crucial distinction between the physical world and the environment of animals. He said that the physical world exists in all spatial and temporal scales, from nanoseconds to nanometers to millennia and galaxies. The animal's environment is limited to the behavioral middle scale. So for humans, the spatial scale of the environment is from millimeters to kilometers, and the temporal scales are from hundreds of milliseconds to years. Gibson also pointed that the environment of animals is perceived in terms of ecological events and not in terms of time. Time is actually an abstraction made by humans. Ecological events have been characterized then as changes in the layout of affordances of the animal environmental system. And notably, the physical world is inherently meaningless, but the environment is not, because it contains affordances. Furthermore, Baggs and Chemero argue that it is necessary to subdivide what Gibson referred to as the environment, and they say that we need to make a finer distinction between, one, the environment as a set of resources for a typical or ideal member of a species, which they call the habitat, and two, the environment as a meaningful, live surroundings of a given individual, which they call the umwelt. It is useful to think about information about affordances for perception as something that exists and can be described according to the potentialities of an agent. So in the habitat, we will have information about affordances that can be thought of as a property of the habitat, and the information for can be conceived as a property of the umwelt. This distinction between physical world, habitat, and umwelt allows for distinguishing the individual's set of affordances, given its biological setup, its development, and her history, which is the umwelt, from the general objective set of affordances that are possible for a group of individuals of a species, the habitat, and those could be seen as dispositions or potential affordances. In other words, there are affordances that exist objectively for an individual as a member of a species or of a group of individuals, and some affordances that are perceived as soliciting for a given individual given its histories and interactions within a particular niche, and that become actualized and thus form part of their ever-changing umwelt. So the question is, how can we characterize the temporally extended character of perception of affordances? And here we will adopt Husserl's analysis of the intrinsic temporal structure of experience that can be applied not just to experience consciousness, but also to embodied action. So thinking about perception based on coordinated motions radically changed the way the agent is related to the environment. And as we said, Gibson noticed, the perception of affordances seem to have this distinctive temporal quality as well. The feeling of past, present, and future are merged, or more exactly, the activity of perception is acknowledged to be retrospective and prospective. So in other words, the concept of affordances makes reference both to the agent past abilities as well as to the future possibilities. So intrinsic temporality in affordances, we can understand it with Husserl's analysis of the intrinsic temporal structure of experience, which can apply not just to consciousness, but also to embodied action. Bertos in 2003, for example, suggested that the Husserlian analysis of the retentional potential structure of experience is a model that also works for processes involved in motor control. So intrinsic temporality can be found in the dynamics of bodily movement and action and manifests itself at both the subpersonal and the personal levels of analysis. This intrinsic temporality is not objective time that can be measured by a clock, although action certainly does take place in time. And intrinsic temporality is something we can find in all the dynamics of bodily movement and action and manifests itself at both the subpersonal and the personal level of analysis, which we will explain further on. So, the Husserl's model, called the Pratsenseit, is represented in this figure, and he applied this model to the conscious perception of a melody. But we will claim that it can be applied to perception in general. It has three structural aspects. The horizontal line ABC represents a temporal object, such as a melody of several notes. The vertical lines represent abstract momentary phases of an enduring act of consciousness. And each phase is structured by three functions. The primal impressions, allowing for the consciousness of an object, a musical note, for example, that is simultaneous with the current phase of consciousness. Retention, R, which retains previous phases of consciousness and their intentional content, and protension, P, which anticipates experience, which is about to happen. It is important to say that one could think that Husserl saw consciousness as an internal metaphysical entity, but I think this is a misreading because we have to consider this, and I quote, consciousness is only as long as it is open to the world. Therefore, there is no interiority or exteriority. There is only one intentional fabric that is indissolubly that of consciousness and the world. In this phenomenological tradition, this amounts to say that consciousness is the experience, the pure experience that happens in the perception of the world. Husserl argued that to do phenomenology properly, that is to attend to the experience themselves, leaving all preconceptions aside, one has to bracket questions about the world beyond experiences. But then he is talking about a pre-given world as an objective scientific phenomena. So this experience, the umwelt, of course, cannot be bracketed. What is bracketed are the judgments and reflections about the world. So we are talking about the same experience, the umwelt, that is going to be temporally structured in this present state. I don't know if it's pronounced like that, I'm sorry. In other words, for Husserl, there can only be experience in the sense just explained because there is an intrinsic temporal structure that supports it, which he called the present state. So summarizing, Husserl's claims and flow have their origin in the retentional and protensional structure of temporal extended experience consciousness, and it is the relations between the retention, primal impression, and protension which constitute the temporality of the flow of experience. So in terms of affordances, to perceive affordances is to experience affordances. There is not a division in the perceiving experiencing. All perception implies an experience that is itself dynamical and will include different temporal scales in its performance, as we will see in the next section. Putting it bluntly, perception experiences of affordances also have a temporal flow that originates in this RIP structure. It's RIP because it's retention, primal impression, protension. So a number of theorists have proposed to capture these subpersonal processes that would instantiate this Husserlian structure shown in the figure before by using a dynamical systems approach. Thomson, Van Gelder, and Varela. And on this view, action and our consciousness experience of action arise through the concurrent participation of distributed regions of the brain and their sensorimotor embodiment, which are established in 3 scales. The first 2, which are said to be directly relevant to protensional retentional processes. So these time scales are divided in the first one, which is the elementary scale, which is it's called the 1 scale because it varies between 10 and 100 milliseconds, and it's applied to intrinsic cellular rhythms. Then the second is the integration scale, the 1 scale, varying from 0.5 to 3 seconds, neuronal processes. Sorry, I said in the one before it's 1/10 scale. And the third one is the narrative scale involving memory, the 10 scale, which is for more than 3 seconds. Sorry about the typo there. So to account for processes, enactivists appeal to the ideas of a dynamical system and diachronic constitution. Brain, body, and environment are said to be dynamically coupled in a way that forms a system, and the coupling is not equivalent to identify of material parts. Rather, it involves physical relational processes. Significant changes in one part of the system will cause changes or adjustments in other parts. For the enactivist, just these dynamical causal relations constitute the system, because these processes occur on several timescales. It is helpful to introduce this threefold distinction in temporal and dynamical registers. It is important to note as well, as Beaton emphasized in 2013, when Varela says neural mechanisms in the threefold explanation he gives, he means it. He supposes that it is the ongoings in the brain that will directly correspond to the details of attention disclosed via phenomenology. And here we want to claim that these 3 temporal scales are all intertwined within the environmental constitutional situation, the diachronical one that we just described, that is involved in the particular embodied perception experience of affordances. In other words, in the integration and in the narrative scale, the neuronal sensorimotor processes are diachronically constituted by the dynamically coupled brain, body, and environment system, and this happens through the perception of affordances.
So, the elementary scale is the basic time scale of neurophysiology. It corresponds to the intrinsic cellular rhythms of neuronal discharges roughly within the range of 10 milliseconds, the rhythms of bursting interneurons, to 100 milliseconds, the duration of an excitatory-inhibitory sequence of postsynaptic potential in a cortical pyramidal neuron. The integration scale, which goes from 0.5 to 3 seconds, is where neuronal processes on this scale are integrated, which at the neurophysiological level involves the integration of cell assemblies. Phenomenologically, the integrative scale corresponds to the experience living present, the level of a fully constituted cognitive operation. Motorically, it corresponds to a basic action, like reaching, grasping, etc. On a dynamical systems interpretation, neuronal level events on the elementary scale synchronize by phase locking and form aggregates that manifest themselves as incompressible but complete acts on the integrative scale. The narrative scale is meant to capture longer time periods that scale to complex actions and cognitive processes that may involve recollection, planning, intention, formation, and so on. Processes occurring on the narrative scale do so after 3 seconds and hypothetically could last much longer. In this way, cognitive processes are distributed across the different timescales and are constituted in a temporally integrated dynamical system. Through the integration and synchronization of the scales is that the perception of affordances are processed almost momentarily. These are aggregates formed that are impossible to comprehend but become complete sensorimotor schemes in the one scale. Neuronal processes are integrated, which at the neurophysiological level involves the integration of cell assemblies all through the body. Phenomenologically, the integrative scale corresponds to the experience living present, the umwelt, the level of a fully constituted cognitive operation, and motorically it corresponds to a basic action, like reaching or grasping. And as we saw in the previous slides, it can also be characterized by the rib structure. Furthermore, from the enactive and ecological perspective, perception of affordances is temporally extended. This because the differences in temporal scales are constitutive of sensorimotor enactive dynamics, and sensorimotor enactive dynamics are constitutive of the perception of affordances. Hence, perception of affordances is intrinsically temporal. And the threefold distinction made by Varela is helpful for thinking how the two approaches can fit together. Thus, perception of affordances is constituted by the integration of the two first scales, and the experience of it has a rib structure. The time to complete the perception of affordances is not dependent on a fixed integration period as measured by a clock. It is dependent dynamically on the number and arrangements of cells assemblies that are contributing at that time in relation with the affordances that the subject is interacting in a given coordination with the environment. That is why the integration scale is flexible, depending on the number of elements in the context and also with the corporeal state and age of the agent, previous experiences, among other things. On an enactivist interpretation, the primal impression is not the origin and point of departure, but the boundary between retention and protension, or the result of a dynamical interplay between retention and protension. The umwelt is then not simply a passive reception of the present, it enacts the present. It constitutes its meaning in the shadow of what has just been experienced, which is the retention, and in the light of what it anticipates, the protention, for a particular agent. Summarizing until now, we can say that the perception of affordances is constituted by the abilities and characteristics of the environment as relations that occur with an intrinsic temporality that is related to different temporal scales interconnected between them. This constitution is important because perception of affordances is then temporally extended and therefore can be characterized by the threefold scale structure proposed by Varela. The two first scales are constitutive of the perception of affordances whenever they are actualized and therefore whenever they bear an umwelt for the agent. But what about the third scale? We will now go into it. For that, we will return to the conception of affordances 2.0 that is actually intended to provide a way of talking about affordances while acknowledging the fact that individual organisms learn. Here I quote Chemero. The variety of niche construction sketched in Affordances 2.0 is an equally tightly coupled animal-environment system. It differs from the much discussed biological case in two ways. First, the constructed niche is for an individual organism, not for a population. Second, it occurs over shorter timescales. An animal's activities alter the world as the animal experiences it. And these alterations to the phenomenological cognitive behavioral niche, in turn, affect the animal's behavior and the development of its abilities to perceive and act, which further alter the phenomenological cognitive behavioral niche, and on and on. Affordances 2.0, therefore, emphasizes the connections between radical embodied cognitive science and its natural allies in biology, that is, developmental systems and niche construction. So here we are introducing learning of affordances, which go into the third temporal scale, the narrative one, in the temporal explanation we are proposing. I want to maintain that perception or perceptual experience occurs at the integrative scale, and that what occurs at the narrative scale is different from perception. It is learning. This goes in line with Jacobs and Michael's 2007 paper, proposal, that there is a short time scale for perceiving and acting, and longer time scales for learning. What we propose is a narrative scale in this threefold distinction proposed by Varela for the narrative scale. At this narrative scale, the affordances are seen as potentialities in the habitat, dispositions, in particular niches, and become umwelts when they are actually perceived. There is a lot to say about learning, of course, but that will be material for another talk. For the present purposes, perceptual learning can be defined as involving the increased ability to detect relevant affordances as the result of novel experience, as actions' capabilities change and thereby affordances themselves change. As I can see, these temporal scales can be a useful toolkit for explaining the perception and learning of affordances, and at the same time unifying enactivism and ecological psychology, claiming that affordances serve a different explanatory role depending on which timescale you consider them at. If you are interested in explaining the embodied assemblies that form the always changing sensorimotor contingencies, then you see the elementary scale. If you are interested in explaining perception at the integrative scale, then affordances are solicitations. If you are interested in explaining change in the animal environment system over developmental time, like learning time, then affordances are around what Chemero said they were when he proposed Affordances 2.0, and one should see at the narrative scale. But it is important to say that the three scales are always intertwined because learning and perception are ongoing processes that in many senses are impossible to separate. So concluding, ecological psychologists can explain how the detection of perceptual information leads to the perception of particular affordances at the integrative scale, while the enactivist theory of sensorimotor agency can explain how an individual selects among perceived affordances in an embodied and situated way, according to her past experiences and learnings as a body-environment system, combining the elementary and the narrative scales. As Baggs and Chemero say, the ecological account of external structure is compatible with the enactivist account of the internal organization of the animal. Life happens in the dialectical confrontation of the two. In radical embodied cognitive science, needs to be understood in terms of the organism-environment system. On a dynamical systems interpretation, neuronal level events on the elementary scale synchronize by phase locking and form aggregates, the sensorimotor contingencies, that manifest themselves as incompressible but complete acts on the integrative scale, the solicitation of affordances. Then the narrative scale is meant to capture longer time periods that scale to complex actions and cognitive processes that may involve recollection, planning, intention formation, and so on, Particularly, that scale could be understood in terms of learning. So, temporal scales matter because affordances serve a different explanatory role depending on which timescale you consider them at. On the standard notion of synchronic constitution, subpersonal elementary scale neuronal processes constitute mental representational contentful processes that somehow scale up to experiences. All of the other factors, environmental, bodily, social, are causal but not constitutive. But in radical embodied cognitive science, mainly in enactivism and in ecological psychology, environment is constitutive because the constitution is diachronic. The temporal scales in which perception of affordances occur are relevant because that is what explains that cognition occurs as a system, agent-environment system, and not only in the elementary scale, as cognitivism would claim. In other words, intentional action takes time. It begins and ends and takes some duration in between. The temporal frame may vary depending on the affordances performed, but they include all the environment agent system and the three scales discussed above, integrated and intertwined. So, returning to scale integration, Kushans and Chemero ask, what exactly is the relationship between the fast and small events and the slow and large events? In both cases, the relationship must be such that events at the elementary scale are constitutive of events at integrative and narrative scales, but are also, in part at least, controlled by events at the integrative and narrative scales. How are temporally extended events at the integrative and narrative scales able to influence the elementary scale events that they are constituted by? I would agree with Kushans and Chemero that synergies are a good answer, and also a very audacious one, to understand the relationship between the narrative scale and the elementary and the integrative. The basic idea is that the actualization of the affordance is what guides the processes in the first two scales, meaning that the causation would be macro to micro and not otherwise. And I quote, "If a behaving human is a synergy at the narrative scale, then the neural processes that partly compose that synergy are constrained by the behavior." End of the quote. And this behavior is given through affordances at the integrative scale. Van Orden and colleagues call it the blue-collar brain, which claims that rather than being the executive in charge of the body, the brain does what is required by the activities of the embodied person. Synergies understood as a functional grouping of structural elements, molecules, genes, neurons, muscles, etc., which together with their supporting metabolic networks are temporarily constrained to act as a single coherent unit. And there is empirical evidence that there are also human tool synergies and interpersonal synergies. So to conclude, the central claim of the present talk is that affordances should be understood in terms of the three different timescales proposed by Varela. I showed that these temporal scales can be a useful toolkit for explaining the perception and learning of affordances, and at the same time unifying enactivism and ecological psychology, claiming that affordances serve a different explanatory role depending on which timescale you consider them at. Finally, sensorimotor enactivism and ecological psychology can be used as complementary explanations through the scales of perception of affordances. While ecological psychology focuses on explaining the dynamics at the level of the organism-environment system, the ecological Gibsonian scale, the narrative and integration temporal scales, sensorimotor enactivism focuses on explaining the dynamics at the intraorganismic level, the elementary and integrative scales. But, remarking it again, the three temporal scales constitute the perception of affordances, where the scales are always integrated and intertwined. Likewise, these temporal scales can be a useful toolkit for explaining the perception and learning of affordances, and at the same time unifying enactivism and ecological psychology, claiming that affordances serve a different explanatory role depending on which timescale you consider them at. If you are interested in explaining the embodied assemblies that form the always changing sensorimotor contingencies, then you see at the elementary scale and a bit of the integrative. If you are interested in explaining perception at the integrative scale, then affordances are solicitations. If you are interested in explaining change in the animal environment system over developmental time, that is learning time, then affordances are around what Chemero said they were when he proposed affordances 2.0, and one should see at the narrative scale. But it is always important to say that the three scales are always intertwined, because learning and perception are ongoing processes that in many senses are impossible to separate, and when seen as a system they can be characterized as synergies. Describing cognitive processes as being constituted in this temporally integrated dynamic system could also be very helpful in explaining more precisely the relationship between cognition and action with this toolkit of temporal scales. Practically, I think this way of thinking could promote research that systematically varies a hierarchy of time scale contexts for both ecological psychology and sensorimotor enactivism. Thank you very much for your attention.
If it's there where I stopped, I think there is the important part is the explanatory role of affordances through temporal scales in order to bridge together ecological psychology and enactivism. So if that got clear, I think we can go to the questions if you like. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably a good place, and I guess other things might come out through the conversation, which will be a benefit too. So I guess those kind of I was just killing a little bit of time there with Fred, just identifying that this is an issue actually that I think a lot of people need to pay more attention to, and I was delighted to see you doing that, and to I'm bringing together a number of different sort of points of literature from enactive, the kind of couple of different enactive and embodied traditions, and the ecological psychology approach. I guess I do have I have I'll start with maybe with a kind of a bit of a poser, I suppose, which is just that something that struck me when you were speaking about the distinction later on in the talk between habitats and umwelts is there that essentially to a certain extent they occur on different timescales. But also it struck me that there is in fact two concepts of temporal scale there. And I'm wondering how to unpick them a little bit. One is that for something to occur over a longer time scale, it might be that it lasts, which means that it sort of it happens and then it hangs around. And it might also be that it just takes a long time. So it's just a slow, drawn-out process. And I guess I'm wondering, is that a sensible distinction, or is in fact lasting it just always is a slow, drawn-out process? Or or was it kind of? I wondered whether habitats are just umwelts that last.
Yeah. As I see it, you can have both of the things, and there's where the narrative scale comes in, because when things last, for more time, according to Varela's threefold distinction, the integration scale can just go up to 3 seconds, no? And maybe you can think about it a little bit more, no? Maybe 4 or 5 seconds in the way that you are doing something in the environment, no? For example, playing a melody, no? In a guitar. So if you are doing that or doing a choreography piece, no? You are mixing a lot of affordances there. So that's one point that I haven't put in together in that, but I want to say that you have to talk about synergies there, no? Because with synergies you would have a lot of the variables taken into account at this big temporal scale happening, But then inside you will have many affordances connecting at the same time in the integrative scales that are happening also in that same time, and the synergy acts as constraints, constraint for that action to happen. So this is why the three scales are always intertwined in complex actions, no? Because when you take something very easy as taking the pencil, then the act is complete very quickly. But then you have complete actions that need a lot of affordances that are intertwined in this complex dynamical system, but always also mixing the learning part and the constraints of the environment for that particular action. I don't know if I'm clear.
Yeah, no, I think that's that's answering another question I had actually, which is good, although possibly raising another. So the way that, part of the way that you described it, and again, there was one slide where your audio really got very choppy for me, so it became quite a little bit hard to follow. So I might just have missed this in some of the way it broke up. But it felt a little bit to me, there's a kind of an internalism, which is somewhat ironic given the origin of the kind of point of view in Varela's work. But it's there's quite an internalist narrative here in the way that the timescales work. That these are sort of brain scales. And so there's a kind of I wonder if there's a sort of more extensive story to tell about how the ecological intrinsic dynamics, as it were, play a role. But you've sort of started to address that a little bit, because it felt, I guess, the simple description of the elementary, integrative, and narrative scales felt kind of all very bottom up. But in fact, what you've just described there was very much not bottom up. That there is the bigger timescales also constrain the smaller ones.
Exactly.
So Melina, again, so Ezekiel's question is, one thing that wasn't very clear to me is whether you are looking into the temporality of affordances as such, or the place of affordances in understanding the temporality of perception, or are these different things for you?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ezekiel. Actually, I think it's a very not affordances as such, but the perception of affordances. So yeah, okay. So what I'm describing is the temporalities of the temporal scales of the perception of affordances, not of affordances as such. And this is important for me because I had that problem in the beginning, and then I realized that it can't be of affordances themselves, because then it wouldn't really make sense. Because if we talk about the perception of affordances, then we can talk of the integration of the two first scales for it, and then we can also talk about learning of affordances in the narrative scales. So it is through affordances that we take the environment, animal system all together, and the timescales serve as an explanatory role in each of the temporal scales of what is happening when we perceive affordances or we engage with affordances, but not as the object affordance itself.
Okay. I guess I wonder, though, to follow up then, there will be, I guess, affordances do have an intrinsic temporality of their own, which will probably play a role here, though, right? So if we think of one of the classic examples of catching a fly ball, a ball is only catchable while it's in the air. So there's a very clear temporality to that affordance. Or even picking up a mug, I can only do so during the period of time when it's sat on the table in front of me, and not when it's in the dishwasher with the door closed and so on. So there is nevertheless still for most affordances also a temporality which is feeding into that mix a bit.
Exactly. Yeah, the thing is here is that as in ecological psychology and enactivism, action and perception are in the same loop all the time. no? You perceive and then act, no? So, and act and perceive all the time in a loop. So by engaging, maybe the term would be to engage with affordances, which includes perceive and act, no? You will have an intrinsic temporality. And that intrinsic temporality actually can change when you get habits on the going, no? When you become skilled at the performance of certain affordances, that intrinsic temporality changes, no? It's not the same the first time a baby grabs a mug that how I do it, no? The first times are very clumsy and the intrinsic temporality is very long because you don't have the sensorimotor scheme and so on. And as you make the habit out of it, the intrinsic temporality shortens a lot. No? So yeah.
So, yes, thanks for that then. So Fred, would you like to?
Yeah, I thank you very much. It was a very, very rich talk. There was so much in there, and I'm afraid the audio was at times rather poor for me, so I may have missed a lot. But there's an awful lot there that's worth pursuing. But the division between the elementary, integrative, and narrative timescales. I think on your first slide you attributed it to Gallagher, and later on you seem to attribute it to Varela, and it's different from Husserl's presence side, right? Mm-hmm. Those three jump out at me as being the three timescales that have been identified in the psychophysics of temporal interval estimation of time perception in the classic work of Paul Frey's. So psychologists have been using these quite a lot, and they've developed a lot of methods for experimentally constructing, as it were, this division. So below about 0.5, things start to become indistinct. They're very, very clearly distinct, and sort of one perceives them all at once up to about 3 seconds, and beyond that, for certain kinds of given tasks, you have to make use of your fingers or counting or something like that. And so you've entered the narrative mode. I wonder to what extent Varela was drawn by this peculiarly constructive psychological work. I don't know if that was the case, but it's always troubled me, and I don't buy it. I think there's lots of reasons to identify all kinds of timescales, but this is a little bit too neat for me. And I'm particularly worried by the narrative timescale. And I found, I hope you're still there. Yes, you are. Yeah. I found the graphic that you use for the narrative timescale quite illuminating, because you used one of those photographic series from Edward Muybridge's classic work of Humans in Motion.
Yeah.
And we are, of course, trained in our imagination to think about what's going on. We are trained now imagistically. We are trained in terms of a particular volumetric representation of space, and photography and motion photography have done an awful lot to encourage us to think of a sort of a mise-en-scène way that things unfold. That's also how we tell stories, usually, by and large, except for the interior bits. We say John was there and Billy was there, and they wrote in and they did things with no particular perspective implied. So the narrative scale seems to me to take a big leap out of the embodied reality that so characterized your treatment of the umwelt and possibly cellular processes. There's too much there. Relationship to the classic studies in psychology of time and this particular representational problem of the narrative time scale are two things that I'd love to hear your comment on.
Yeah. Well, the just to clarify, yeah, the first one who took it in this embodied cognitive science was Varela, and then Gallagher took it again and actually has a work with Varela, no, at some point. And then actually I met Gallagher, and he introduced me to these ideas when I talked to him at some point. So yeah, Varela was thinking about actually taking phenomenology into the conception of how we understand time consciousness, and he was following up Husserl and also the psychologists who were desiring to understand what was time consciousness in this really metaphysical, difficult sense of it. and so he wanted it to bring it into science, and so he developed the neurophenomenology, which he called, and then he said that he wanted to use this threefold distinction in order to use only the internal part of the phenomenology of experience, of time consciousness. So he wanted to say, and actually, just to say this, I started my PhD dissertation with this question: how could we characterize temporal experience, no, in the classical psychology sense? But then I took it apart because it was too complicated, and then I just wanted to. I just stayed with the cognition part, the action, no, the action in the agent part.
For me, there's a friction here, because the sense in which any psychologist, Paul Fraser, and anyone working in that vein would speak of the perception of time or of something like temporal experience bears little or no relation to the way that those words are used in Husserlian phenomenology or in enactive cognitive science or in Varela's work. They're really poles apart as far as I can see. I wonder, though, is there some cross, I won't say pollination,
yeah,
it sounds too positive, cross pollution going on here?
Yeah, what I try to do, or what I want to do, is to use also Merleau-Ponty a lot in his in how he understands Husserl, in the way that experience is all the way happening with the interaction with the world, and that is where enactive and ecological psychology come in, because when you take the experience, all of experiences as perception themselves of the agent environment system, then you can say that you can explain how experience happens in this way, not talking about the agent environment system as a unit of analysis, and not just what is happening inside the brain or what is just happening in the internal voice phenomenology type of explanation, but how experience in itself is happening. So I think for that, you can use the threefold distinction of scales, because that explains how actually perception of affordances can happen at different points in the way it happens, and then with the learning processes of the narrative, because you don't live in an eternal present, no? You go accumulating memories and learning new things and experiencing new things that also get into the stream or flow of experience. So I think maybe it's not there yet, I can say that for sure, but I think it's a good way to get into the proper phenomenology within radical embodied cognitive science, no? Which I think it's a desirable project, at least.
No? Yeah. Thank you. Okay, that's great. No, that's kind of a nice encompassing point, I think, on which to finish. I'm just realizing that we're approaching the hour mark, and this is probably a sort of a nice avenue to the future that it's worth probably a good point to finish up on. So I will I'll just say thank you very much, Melina, for a sort of fruitful, really engaging and rich talk, and to remind people again that the conversation can continue on the discussion forum for this seminar, this particular seminar, on the ensoseminars.com website. So thanks again, Melina, and we will see everyone in a month's time for our next ENSO seminar.
Okay, thank you very, very much for being here and inviting me. Okay.
Thank you.